It's been a couple months now since E3 2017, and one thing I find really surprising is that while there are still few games being discussed from that time, such as Battlefront 2 and Beyond Good and Evil 2, no one is really talking about the Shadow of the Colossus remake. After all, Shadow of the Colossus is generally seen as one of the most important games in the PlayStation 2 library, and while I don't think it had the same impact as, say, Final Fantasy VII did for the PlayStation 1, I still don't think we should underestimate praise of that level. That seems to be what the PlayStation conference at E3 did, though. The remake was just kinda shoehorned into the conference with little to no fanfare, and it's really confusing to me why Sony wouldn't want to blast and promote that game to high heaven. One of the largest and most immediate reasons I can think of is that Sony wasn't too sure about how the fans would react to the announcement. Judging by the actual fan reaction, though, it might have not been what Sony was expecting. Many voiced for some odd reason that Sony is trying to milk the Shadow of the Colossus franchise, even though Shadow of the Colossus has never sold well on any platform that they've released it on, and it's only had, 2 releases? No. What I think Sony was expecting was the other reaction they got, which was the more apt complaint. You see, Shadow of the Colossus, which I will now call Shadow because I'm already pretty sick of saying the name, has an extremely distinct atmosphere that no other game in the history of ever really has, or could ever really be replicated on something that was not a 6th generation console. Shadow has these really distinct PS2 type limitations that make the more realistic graphics that it did indeed pull off all the more impressive. For instance, a lot of the game has these very distinct PS2 style textures on the environments. The mountains have these repeated rock textures, the ground doesn't have any grass that stands up and instead has a grass texture that just sits on the floor. Even the temple walls in some of the cutscenes have these 2D textured walls that have a distinct pattern to them. These all add to the large amount of charm that the original has. Shadow of the Colossus is celebrated by many a gamer as being a fantastic piece for the time period it was released in. By making a new, from the ground up, realistic remake removes a lot of the charm the original still has to this day, and it makes it feel a slight bit less special, at least in my opinion. This is not to say it's impossible to capture a rough estimate of the feeling of the original Shadow of the Colossus on a modern day console, just that you can't capture the same feeling. We already have precedent for this, seeing as The Last Guardian was trying to capture the feeling of Ico, and did succeed in quite a number of ways, even with its semi-realistic art style. A large part of Shadow's charm comes large in part due to its incredibly unique lighting fixture, along with the distinct colors that it produces. Shadow of the Colossus is a game that looks like it's constantly bathed in this weird, ethereal, turquoise hue. The remake doesn't really do this hue, at least that often. It seems to be more concerned with this fancy, realistic lighting that looks gorgeous, but it completely changes the extremely moody and somber atmosphere. Something I find kind of hilarious though, is that when I first saw the multiple colossi they showcased in the PS4 version, they honestly didn't really impress me that much. Sure, I was kind of impressed with the amount of realistic textures the colossi could contain now that we've upgraded them to PlayStation 4 hardware, but I think my initial reaction is just an incredibly large testament to the original Shadow. Shadow PS2 had these extremely enormous colossi that looked incredibly detailed and realistic, despite being ran on something as technologically dated as the PlayStation 2. This is so much so that when I look at the new updated versions on the PlayStation 4, I can almost believe that they were upgraded from a PlayStation 3 game and not a PlayStation 2 game. In fact, considering the PlayStation 3 version only runs at a stable 30 frames per second, Shadow of the Colossus might as well just be a PlayStation 3 game that's trying to run on the PlayStation 2. So I think that the Shadow of the Colossus remake isn't that hyped, because many folk don't really think that the added graphical fidelity and the smoother frame rate are all that impressive in comparison to the original PS3 version. Which is kind of a shame, because for me personally, I don't feel like either version is better or worse than the other. They're just different. both being large landmark titles for their own respective consoles, being done late in their lifespans. I say this when the PlayStation 4 Pro was just released, and they're probably going to milk that system to all high hell, and we'll probably see a PlayStation 5 in like 2021 or even as late as 2022. Christ, this is going to be a long console generation. Anyways, as always, subscribe if you thought this was actually good, and I'll see you in the next one. I promise that these short videos won't be the only things I make going forward.